And so as you will see in the chat in a moment, the NASDAQ Center provides programs, resources, and exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. So definitely make sure to check out those links and resources in the chat. And then just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, let us know where you're dialing in from in the chat. And second, we are going to open up for live Q&A at the end of the event. So please make sure to submit your questions for us in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we will try our best to get to all of them. And of course, none of what we do could be possible at the center without all of the amazing support from our sponsors, including NASDAQ, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, Airbnb, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Sawyer, Microsoft Entrepreneurship for Positive Impact, BPM, and HubSpot for Startups. We are humbled by their contributions and hope you are grateful too. Awesome. California, Miami, New York, Texas, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Seoul, New Orleans, London. Welcome, welcome, Italy. Welcome, everyone. Oh, super exciting to see everyone from all across the globe. And so before we get started, we always like to launch a couple polls just to step back and see how everyone's doing today. So I'm going to launch this first poll, which asks, how are you feeling? Fearful, anxious, surviving, or optimistic? Just a little temperature gauge of the room. I'll give everyone a few moments to submit a response here. Thank you for participating. All right, I'm going to end this poll and share these results. Optimism is in the lead. We always love to see that, but definitely some feelings of anxiety and surviving. Hopefully some of what we talk about will address those feelings that some of y'all are having. All right, I'm going to stop sharing this poll and launch the second poll. What is keeping you up at night? Finance, sales, marketing, scale, pivot, team, or surviving? This one tells us a little bit about your current entrepreneurial needs so we can continue providing relevant content to all of you. All right, I'll give it a few more moments. Thank you for participating as always. All right, I am going to end this poll and share the results, which are close. Marketing coming in the lead, relevant for our topic today, but finance and sales close behind. All across the board, we will take this into account. Thank you so much. Now, without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our special guest, Jenny Farias, founder and CEO of Brands and Humans. Jenny, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your insights. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm going to share my screen and let me know when everybody can see it. All right. Hopefully everybody can see it. All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening. There's people from Seoul, Korea, and just all over the world. That's exciting. And I'm also feeling a little anxious, but really optimistic to be here today. My name is Jenny, and I'm the founder of Brands and Humans. We are a brand performance and fractional marketing agency for technology and impact startups. Before we get started, I did want to give a quick shout out to the NASDAQ team for putting on this amazing webinar series. Michelle and Anna have been great to work with, and to leading today's hot topic, which is around how to build your minimum viable brand. So thank you. And with that, let's dive right in. So before we get in, so most of you as entrepreneurs, you're familiar with the better known MVP, right? So your MVP is your minimum viable product. And so the typical startup launch cycle will go a little something like this. You know, you've identified a problem and discovered that there's a big market for it. Hopefully you've done some product, market research to understand your market and your ideal customer profile a little bit better. You've built your prototype, which is your MVP, right? And then you've launched it to an audience, piloted it to customers, right? And then gathered feedback and applied it to further refine your product. So everybody in the startup landscape, or those of you that are entrepreneurs that are thinking about creating a company, this is kind of the process of starting, right? But then there's, then we go to here. Here's the thing, right? Just because you've discovered that there is authentic demand for your product doesn't necessarily mean that your startup is going to be successful. And this could be really for many reasons. Sometimes you have an MVP and the market potential is huge, right? But you've had a hard time raising capital because your pitch maybe is focusing on the wrong things. I want to give an example to you today for the entrepreneurs that are on here on a pitch that actually focused on the right things. And it's an industry that had no innovation for 50 years. And it's probably one of the best pitches I've ever heard. And it goes a little something like this. And just contextualize this with me for a moment. It's a product used by half of the world's population for 40 years of their life, every single month, 7 days a month, 5 to 10 times per day. And there's been no innovation in this category for 50 years. You can imagine every investor's brain being like, WTF, like, how can I be part of that cash cow? What do you think the product was? And people can add it to the chat. Tampons. And just, look at all the period product companies that have sprung up in the last 5 years that got funding, that, that actually are venture backed, that really found a way to innovate. And the moral of the story here is that just because you have a great product, you found authentic demand, doesn't equate success, but somebody really figured out in this concept how to pitch their concept with impact for the investor crowd, that they knew what their hook was, right? They knew who their audience was in this case and how to talk about the money. And they were able to raise the capital that they needed. So really, this is a good example of marketing your concept effectively through impact messaging and really the bottom line leading into that. So now, if we think about it, just in fact, of the startups that are launched, there's about 72,000 startups in the United States right now. 90% of them actually fail in the first 3 to 5 years, and about 34% of those fail to find product market fit, but 22% actually fail due to marketing problems. And if we can go back to the tampon example, marketing was part of that. They were able to clearly articulate and tell their story in a way to an audience that they needed on their side, right? They needed the capital to be able to reinvest into their MVP and their product and continue going to market. And so if you're lacking some marketing strategy, or your brand or lack thereof, in this case being part of the problem, this is going to be really important. And just a side note, you'll see my love for memes, and we use it as a communication tool at Brands and Humans. It really aligns with our core values, which is to be relatable and to have fun. And so we'll talk later on about the importance of developing a voice guide for your startup that can really help to crystallize how you communicate to your various audiences. And now going to the next one. Okay, so let's talk about it. Okay, beyond the MVP, you've got your minimum viable product. So now meet the MVP. So it's the lesser known, but very important minimum viable brand. It really is the perfect complement to your MVP. And think about it as like the olive to your martini, or the hot sauce to your taco, or, things that pair really well together. So now we're going to, what does it entail, right? So we talk about, so say hello to the real MVP of a startup, right? In this case, we're saying most valuable player. And to explain it further, it's really the simple and genius way to create a consistent foundational brand for startups. It really can be refined and scaled over time, and it won't blow up your budget or timeline. And let's pause here and think, why is this important for entrepreneurs, right? A strong brand is really critical to the success of any business. At the end of the day, your brand is the first impression that you're going to have on potential investors if you're trying to raise capital for your startup. and customers that you want to buy your product or service, right? It really sets the tone for all future interactions. And more importantly, for people to take away is that and recognize as founders and business owners, your brand is not your logo. We get this all the time. It's, business owners think, oh, I already worked on my logo and I did my colors and my site, when I first started my company, and they treat it as kind of like a project. And really, a brand is the perception that people have of your business, right? And branding is the process of actively shaping that perception. So if you think about it in a nutshell, branding is who you are and marketing is how you build awareness. And so that's a really important takeaway to learn from this. So now we're going to look at who would benefit from an MVP. So there's really two types of companies that an MVP would benefit from, and we categorize them as pre-launch and pre-revenue. So these are companies, you have an idea, you've identified that there's authentic demand for your market or idea. You need to create a strong brand identity that resonates with potential investors and future customers. You start with really a core set of values. A positioning strategy is critically important, and some brand messaging guidelines and a visual identity. So it's really kind of the core basic elements that you need to go to market in a way that is cohesive. With these basics, your startup can really create focused brand communications and without spending, a ton of time or money that you simply don't have at this stage. The other kind of business or startup that would benefit from an MVP is maybe you have launched your MVP a couple of years ago. Maybe you got some traction, but you learned from early stage feedback that you need to pivot, or you're not getting the traction that you need, or there's really little to no interest in your concept. It's not investable. It's not fundable. You're kind of hearing all this negative feedback. Also, maybe it's because your business lacks a foundational and identifiable brand for investors or customers to connect to. So the bottom line, I think these are really kind of the two types of startups that can benefit from this. And it really just will help set the foundation for your brand, establish yourself in a crowded, marketplace, build some trust and credibility early on, and really, start to differentiate yourself from competitors. So, and how do we know this to be true? If we look at some of the biggest brands in the world today, and let's look at the king of branding himself, Richard Branson. He knew really little about marketing and branding when they first started Virgin Records back in 1972. And he simply formed the business around personal values and went from there. This is really important because at the end of the day, you as founders and entrepreneurs, your business is typically a reflection of the owners, right? They should reflect your values, qualities, behaviors, and quirks. I think too many times first-time entrepreneurs try to really spend so much time like morphing their brand into some sort of idealized or perfect image that you think your customers are going to like, or you think that an investor is going to like. And as a consequence, the brand doesn't seem very authentic or doesn't acquire a lot of like texture or character. So the biggest takeaway here is, and the goal in launching is keep it simple, just be authentic and real, and really the rest will start to take shape. And now we think about, okay, so what does it actually entail to build an MVP? And we look at it into three critical components, right? There's the building a cohesive brand foundation is step one. So getting super clear on your purpose, it's probably brand strategy 101. That is your why. Why are you doing this? What is the impact that you want to leave? What's your origin story? I think as an entrepreneur, it's very difficult and you're going to get tossed in a lot of different ways. And so having your why be your anchor always and getting clear on that from the very early stages is really important. Then, establishing your mission, your what, like, how are you doing it? And moving away from a really antiquated way of crafting mission statements that are just so pie in the sky, make them action oriented, put some timelines behind it. You want to get X customers within a period of 3 years because of XYZ, like make them more action oriented. really establish a core set of values that align with you. About 89% of consumers actually will do business with a brand that shares their same values. So I think that's really important. Coming up with your unique selling proposition or value proposition early on. How are you helping somebody? What issues are you solving? What are the pain points? So establishing that, and then coming up with your positioning strategy. So who you are in the marketplace, right? How do you perceive where's the gap or the white space? And then coming up with some voice and messaging guidelines that you can carry throughout all your communications. So that's cohesive brand foundation 101. Then creating an attractive visual identity to pair with that. So these are the visual elements, right? So a modern logo, colors, typography, and an image strategy that can be very unique, right? That can be carried through your social media, your website, your collateral. It just starts to have like a really cohesive look and feel. And as a startup, that's really important because you want your brand, wherever any medium it's represented, to look and feel like the same kind of person. So it starts to become really identifiable. And then lastly is to really develop an optimized digital presence. Like if you do not have a website or you're not on social, like do you even exist, right? I think that's a really critical component. And there's ways, as for a startup, like there's so many free tools, there's so many cost-effective ways on doing this at a smaller scale out the gate. But just having like a launch website of like 5 pages, right, that really communicates who you are with strong messaging hook points, a clear explanation of the product or service that you're offering, right? And then simple calls to action, how to get in touch. We see it so many times that companies want to get like all fancy pants with their CTAs, and they lose the user, and they don't really know how to get in touch, or they don't have the proper sales funnel built in the back end so that they can follow up with the people that are interested. So those are kind of the core basics on how to really go about building an MVP. So now let's zoom out. You've got your minimum viable product and have a little bit of understanding on what the process is to do that. You've now understood what it takes to build an MVB, right? How do you now cultivate this into a human-centric brand? And notice the shift, right? That I don't use customer-centric and we're using human-centric. And this is a big thing for us. I think there's been a shift in companies following a more purpose advantage framework, one we call whole brands as well. And it really is a new wave of entrepreneurs and startups that have set out to make a commitment to making a positive change in the world. Really, we believe at the end of the day, business can and should be a force for good. And so the brands that are approaching it from this point of view are really starting to outpace their competitors tenfold. And we'll share some examples around that. So if we look at 4 critical components in what it takes to create and cultivate, and this happens over time, right? You cannot just do this once as a project. It's got to be an ongoing thing. A human-centric brand from the very beginning, from when you're starting. I think step 1 is really developing a strong brand ethos. That's the character of your company. And we're going to get a little bit more in depth of how to do that. Number 2 is really to cultivate a human-centric brand. It's got to be rooted in purpose for the greater good. You cannot just, say that you've got a human-centric brand and all you're wanting to create this startup for is to make money. You want to become a unicorn and sell it for $1 gazillion and be acquired. And although that might be part of your intention kit, I think the impact that you're making in the world, I think is much more, that's much more connected to the human-centric sort of framework. Find out and, early on what commitments you want to make, what causes you want to support, and kind of integrate that into the decisions you're making as you're growing your startup. The other one is kind of make it part of your business strategy and every decision that you do. I think, historically branding and marketing has been kind of cultivated as a silo and not really connected to the overall corporate strategy. In the human-centric framework, it really is something that's completely integrated. So every decision that your business makes, you've got to look at it through the lens. Like, does this align with who we are as a company? Is it in alignment with how we want to show up? And then lastly, which kind of leans into this one a little bit, it's your culture is your brand, right? That there's no other way around it. And so how do you create culture? It's through the actions that you take, and that's really cultivated over time. So make sure that you're creating a culture that you're connecting often, and not only to your customers, moving away with the customer is always right and just the customer being like the ultimate be all. I think the best brands today are the ones that grow from the inside out. They invest in their cause, they invest in their people first, and then the rest starts to kind of trickle down. So let's get into brand ethos, which is not a very popular marketing term that everybody knows. And so if you're sitting there scratching your head, what is the hell is brand ethos? And that is coined by Aristotle. The word ethos comes from character. And today it really refers to the values that distinguish one person from another. Or in marketing terms, the connection between a brand and its audience. So we define brand ethos into 3 pillars: authenticity, consistency, and differentiation. And we'll go one by one and kind of give some context on how this is done. So if we think about authenticity, right? Like a look at authenticity. Are you walking the talk, or are you just saying what people want to hear? CVS is a great example of this. When they rebranded as a health services company and they stopped selling cigarettes several years ago, they lost $2 billion in sales as a result. That's huge. That's huge. But that just shows you the bigger impact that they were trying to make, and their pillar of like being authentic to health and wellness and being that kind of company surpassed like just the decision to stay, keep that profit line going. To further validate, right now, having a brand that's rooted in values and ethics will, in the long run, will win, right? If we look at Unilever as another example, they've got 400 brands in total. And of those 400, 28 of their sustainable brands are responsible for a whopping 75% of their growth. So it just, the numbers and the stats like prove time and time again that companies that are approaching it from this lens are really outpacing their competitors. Now, another important pillar is consistency. And we get this a lot, how consistent you should be with your graphics and, the things you do. We think it's really important, especially as a startup. Do your customers feel your ethos, your character when they visit your website, your social media, they interact with your team? Or is it all like very hodgepodge and like all over the place? It seems like different companies talking, right? That's not a good experience, right? You're confusing people. And so if we look at Apple, their ethos is believing in the simple, not the complex. And it shows up in their packaging, their UX UI on their app. You walk into their store and it's, just this very pristine, modern experience. And so they're really taking that ethos and making sure that it carries through their entire customer experience. Another benefit of having a brand that's consistent and cohesive is, according to Salsify, I read this stat recently, 46% of consumers would actually pay more for brands that they trust, right? And so like Apple, you're able to command premium pricing for products because of the ethos that they've really spent like years building. And the last one in the brand ethos pillar is differentiation, which is really important. How are you differentiating yourself? Your why is something that you can really have some fun with and really lean into hard, that differentiates your brand, makes it memorable, and helps you build community. some of the best brands right now, they're not working in a silo. They're using their actual community, their users to be the brand, right? They're empowering that. They're using user-generated content. So that's, incredibly important. Accenture actually says that 66% of people are attracted to a brand if it has a great culture, does what it says it's going to do, and delivers on its purpose. So differentiating yourself and kind of using these strategies can become incredibly important in creating a strong brand ethos. And now we're going to have a little bit of fun. We're going to take a look at a brand that did all of this. They created a really strong MVB. They had a huge human-centric mission, and they had a ton of fun with this. And I love this brand. We have it at our house, and it's something that is something to be said for in the way that they've kind of approached it. And for you guys that don't know Tushy, they're a brand that's absolutely crushing human-centric branding. It's a venture-backed startup, started in 2016, I think. They did raise some capital. They created a modern bidet attachment for your toilet. You think bidet, like not the sexiest product in the world. How can we make this fun? They definitely found ways to do that. They're basically world leaders in saving your butt, literally and figuratively. And really their purpose is, they're trying to outdo, pun intended there, the toilet paper industry with their sustainable approach to bidets, right? So let's see kind of some examples of how they did that. Okay, messaging is such a big component, right? And getting really succinct with your messaging is one of the hardest things that we have as entrepreneurs and founders, because we want to say so much. This is a great example of using messaging that cuts to the chase. And this is their true line, right? Their descriptor: a modern bidet for people who poop. I mean, can you get more to the point than that? You kind of read and you're like, okay, yeah, that's me, right? I fit that profile. So the takeaway, I think, here for founders is when developing your MVP for your startup, understanding that messaging is one of the important aspects, and having compelling hook points that captures people's attention quickly is really important. Don't get over explaining, be straight to the point. I often tell my clients, if it's not a sentence that you would ever say out loud to somebody, like at a dinner table across a conversation, it probably shouldn't make it into your copy. So this is a good example of messaging that's really done well. Now we're going to take a look at credibility. Using customer stories to add credibility is super important in any business, right? But this really becomes critical in the startup landscape, because people believe other people at the end of the day. They don't necessarily believe brands, especially if you don't have that longevity or brand trust to kind of lean on, right? So when when you're building your startup, it's critical to use social proof, right? To add cred and capture testimonials, have fun with it. You can pair with a video or a photo. It's always better. Let's take a look at, some of these hilarious quotes that Tushy pulled from some of their customers. Clean as a nun during Easter Mass by Elena, a real pooping human. I mean, you can't have more fun than that, right? So I think that is an incredible just takeaway on making sure you're capturing those early stage customer stories and leveraging that in your marketing so that it comes across really authentic. The next one is social awareness. So this kind of ties back into the purpose advantage, right? To have a brand that's socially responsible. If you're wanting to cultivate a human-centric brand, is one of the key components of living out your human-centric goals. And actually, according to Deloitte, read an article recently, 80% of customers would actually pay more for a product or service if the money went to an environmental or social purpose, or even higher wages for employees. And if we look at some of the examples that Tushy is doing here, just using stats that really kind of make us think, right? By switching to a bidet, you could save around 384 trees in your lifetime and things of that. That makes, if those are some of your values as a person, as a consumer, that automatically wants you to, like, piques your curiosity to learn more about this business. The last one, actually, in terms of, core components of what they've done really well, is using data, right, is always important. It's key to making people think. One of the mind-blowing statistics that I read when I was, pulling this case study for Tushy is that, did you know that the United States only has 4% of the world's population, but uses 20% of its global toilet paper supply? Now, that's a shit ton of paper. And it just is mind-blowing. So when you're a startup, you don't have a lot of internal data to use. You don't have a lot of case studies built out, right? I think it's important to capture stats that really expose the problem that you're trying to solve for, and use that in your marketing, because that really kind of helps to cultivate that story of that impact that you're trying to leave. And then, what can we learn from Tushy and kind of what they've done well? I think they've had an MVP, right, in a market that had authentic demand that they disrupted by coming up with a sustainable alternative, right? They had a really cohesive minimum viable brand that really just resonated with the customer demographic that they were going after. And then they applied some human-centric principles into cultivating this brand that will leave an impact. And really, this is the business model of the future. So these are some really important kind of tips that you all can kind of take away in how you're working on your marketing. And that brings us to the end of this segment of the presentation. So for those of you that are still around, other than my dad, because I'm sure he's still out there watching me, now we're going to be transitioning more to a fireside chat conversation with the NASDAQ team. And we're have some cool Q&A, and then we'd love to hear your questions if you want to share them in the chat. We'll be happy to do that. Couple things before we take away this slide. If you want to stay connected with me, you want to learn more about the MVB, slide into the DM. I respond all the time. It's Brands X Humans on Instagram. You can also find me on LinkedIn. And the other thing I would encourage you to do, if you like kind of this no BS tips on how to do really cool marketing that's human centric, we've just launched our blog. It's called the Startup X Factor. And that's on the website, brandsxhumans.com/insights. And there'll be a little lead capture there for you to subscribe. And then we'll be sending something out about every 10 days or so with new articles with a whole different, fresh perspective on how to do this. So with that, I'll give it back to Michelle.
Amazing. Jenny, thank you so much. That was such an amazing overview. So many great examples. And I already knew about Tushy, but I don't have one. And it makes me really, really want one for so many reasons now. So that's just, thank you so much for such a great presentation.
Yeah.
All right, let's kind of jump right in. So just to start off, can you dive a little bit deeper into how the MVB is different from a comprehensive brand strategy?
Yeah. I think, the main difference really is there is a lot of overlap, right? But if you think about the MVB focuses on the minimum set of elements needed to establish a basic level of recognition and connection with a target audience, while a comprehensive brand strategy is really more in depth. You've found product market fit. You've figured out who your ideal customer profile is. It's sometimes you've got a target audience, but you don't know, is it, we're targeting enterprise companies, but is it the HR leader? Is it the CEO? Is it the business dev person that's going to be, the potential buyer of that? I don't think that that when you're first launching a brand. And so the comprehensive brand strategy allows you more time to make those deeper connection points,
Yeah.
so that you can really have something a little bit more comprehensive. If you want to think of it like you have like a starter home, right? That over
Mhm.
time you'll learn more about what you don't like about the house, like what upgrades you want to make, you want to renovate, you want to add a pool because it's going to increase the value of
Yeah.
your home. You now have some money, so you want to bring in an
Mhm.
interior designer to make the space cohesive and inviting. And
Right.
so think about it in that sense. Like MVB is kind of like the core, the essentials done in a really like cohesive way. And then full brand strategy is like once you've got some more money to invest, some more data to go off. And that I feel like that those are like really the main differences.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful, especially as, different startups are kind of just evaluating what stage of growth they're at and what's the next right move to continue on a trajectory of success. So I think that differentiation is super helpful. So you gave so many great examples during that presentation. I'm wondering, do you have an example of a business that's used this MVB framework to break into a new market or reach a new audience? And maybe if you could also just discuss like other positive effects that you've seen businesses experience from identifying their MVB and building that out early on.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I think one business that comes to mind that they're actually here. They're based in Charlotte and Charlotte and Atlanta is kind of their hub, but it's an
Mhm.
early stage startup. They're absolutely crushing it right now in the tech startup space. The name of the company is called Zinnia,
Mhm.
Zinnia, and it's a B2B SaaS based event planning software. Essentially, what they're doing is they're helping companies bring people together. So imagine like sales kickoffs, team offsites, client dinners, leadership retreats through tech that help people within organizations quickly scope it out, find these venues. It's right now, it's like kind of like a really manual process that takes tons of hours.
Yeah.
They launched their MVP this year. They've done incredibly well at really just building not only the MVP, but building a minimum viable brand that has a super cohesive origin story. It's very values driven and there's a huge market opportunity. And so they're gaining a lot of attention from the investor community. Saw her, the founder pitch
Mhm.
on stage. She happens to be a female founder. Woohoo! Which is part of an organization that I'm actually a co-founder in as well. It's
Cool.
called Gwen, Growing Women Entrepreneurs Network, and her name is Lauren Moderano, is the CEO. And another thing she's done incredibly well is leverage her personal brand to fuel the startup. So some things that I feel like in summary, what I'm seeing they have done well in using the MVB framework is that one, they found a market that has authentic demand. I think you've got to
Mhm.
start there because if you're trying to create a startup and you want it to be, investable, fundable, and get the capital that you need it to scale, you've got to go after a market that makes sense. And in her case, 74% of companies are now hybrid after COVID, right? Or fully remote. It's a $500 billion market.
Mhm.
And one of the things that she told me early on when we were having a conversation is that she found a market and not an idea, and her market was human connection.
Mhm.
And because of this idea that these companies are fully remote, I mean, you're not seeing your teammates. There's nothing that replaces that human connection. So if she can facilitate and come up with a piece of tech that like at least enables companies to bring people together, even if it's once a quarter or whatever it is, I think that really was her biggest thing. The other thing that their branding is really just, it's a clean branding. They've got a really unique origin story. And so if you don't know, zinnia is the fastest growing, most resilient flower in the world.
Oh.
And yeah, it's super cool. And so what they've done is the idea is that they help teams cross pollinate ideas to build stronger relationships through in-person connection. And
Mhm.
so it's just something, it's catchy, it sticks in your mind. There's a really cute origin story there. Um,
Yeah.
the last thing that they've done is just the like leaning into the values, I think, is a really big thing, because you don't have a lot to go off, right? When you're starting
Mhm.
your brand and your business. And as I said earlier, 89% of people will do business with a brand that shares the same values.
Yeah.
And so she has created values that she's actually like living up to. And so she's implemented some systems where she's, one of the things is like, how can we support you? So she ends like every conversation with a customer or with her team. How
Mhm.
can I support you? And it's just like she's sharing it a lot on LinkedIn, and you're starting to see her personal branding really pair well with her startup. And it's so cohesive and connected. And that one, I think they have really embodied what it takes to like have a good MVP, build the MVP, and then now how do you infuse these like human centric principles? And they're early stage, they're still in startup.
Right. I love that. And I think it's so important that you emphasize that kind of separation, but also like the interconnectedness of like your personal brand and like your business brand, because I know so many entrepreneurs, especially like early on, are still kind of trying to like create, like figure out how to balance the two, and where exactly the right balance is for those that they're trying to communicate with. So that's just so important to emphasize. Um, so for, startups or small businesses here that, might have limited time or budget, what are some ways that they can prioritize and like allocate their resources to develop their MVP, especially like those visual identity elements and like your digital presence, like those kinds of things?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of different, there's probably like I would say 4 key things that founders and early stage entrepreneurs should focus on.
Mhm.
One is, first of all, get curious and talk to people. I think this happens so many times. It's like, oh, I have an idea. And then I love the color purple, so I'm just going to do a purple logo. Like,
Yeah.
it's all like a personal thing, and it's all from like our own minds, right? And so get outside of your mind a little bit, talk to people, develop a hypothesis of your target customer and the issues you're facing, right? And do like a small market research kind of fundamentals for your MVB. I think that start there, right? Don't run off assumptions. Establish some key segments for your target customer profile. So you're going to get a mix of different opinions on what issues are they facing and how many people are facing that similar issue. I
Mhm.
think that is really important, and start scrappy, tap into your personal networks or other connections. You don't have to do like a fancy old school focus group. Come up with like 6 questions or whatever they are and ask them to each of these 10 to 20 folks, right? And
Mhm.
then you start to develop a hypothesis around that. I think having that as kind of like step one is critical. And then you focus on the essentials, right? So you identify the essential elements. It's what it's going to take to build your brand, following that MVB framework, right? So you've got to do what's your purpose? What's your value proposition? And then also like what is your positioning? Like having a positioning strategy is critical, because a lot of companies fail to do that, and they understand that there's customers out there, right? So they're competing in a space where there's competition, but create a matrix. Like, here are the 5 customers. Here's what their brand positioning is, what their unique selling point is. Then find that gap, find that white space on what are you going to do differently? Is it going to be a better UX UI? Is the pricing going to be different? Just figuring out like what's going to be special about it. I think that's really key. And then utilizing free and or low cost resources. We live in an age now, through thanks to tech, there's so many tools out there
Mhm.
to create. You can use Canva to create your graphics and templates. Webflow is now what a lot of like the early stage startups are using. You can create a really sleek like 5-page launch website. get
Mhm.
somebody on Fiverr that's like a developer and, can do it for you at a relatively low cost. So there's different tools on figuring out how to do it in a cost effective way. And then
Mhm.
the main thing is like really start small, um,
Mhm.
and then iterate, because everything in the startup landscape, whether it's an MVP or an MVP, you shouldn't go ham and go crazy and
Yeah.
investing tons of money. You need to, like, marketing is a lot of testing and learning, right? So if you don't put it out there and get that feedback and then adapt it and have it evolve and change as you grow,
Mhm.
then you're spending a lot of time and money that's unnecessary.
Right. Yeah. It's like so worth it to just make the investment to do that continuous iteration. It's like you're kind of playing the long game, but you get that feedback, and you can actually make more informed decisions, for your business. So it can be tough to stick it out, but, it's so important. And you touched on something that kind of leads me to my next question, which was, about, differentiation. So, um, how can startups balance their desire to differentiate themselves, especially like with industries where like there's a really potentially like crowded market, and with that need to clearly communicate its unique selling proposition. And, like Tushy Lake was such a great example. But, what are some ways that entrepreneurs can kind of think about managing that balance?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think it all really, again, it's not really a stretch from like the themes of what we've been talking about today, but it's really around the idea. And we get this question from founders a lot, like, because they want to be so unique, they tend to get really fancy, and like they're trying to do like all these like crazy things to like stand out. And sometimes like simple is better. So number one, I feel like just understanding like who you're talking to, like who your target audience is, identifying like those key pain points, determining what factors are most important to them when making a purchasing decision,
Mhm.
and then having that inform branding and marketing decisions. So if you're just doing it again, running off assumptions and trying to do something radically crazy and fun just for the sake of like standing out, it can backfire on you. And I think following like a system and a framework, and then using that and testing and learning is probably always the better approach. More than anything, I think focusing on your core USP, your unique selling proposition, like thinking about what is the primary benefit that your product or service has that sets you apart from
Mhm.
your competitors, and really like lead with that. I think if there is something completely unique in how you're doing it, I think put that at the forefront
Mhm.
of your communications. And then you can differentiate a little bit deeper, right, with secondary benefits, right? That these should
Yeah.
be clear and concise, highlighting like how you solve for, different things that might be meaningful. Maybe you offer like a unique pricing model, it's a subscription, you have like a free the 14 window trial or whatever that looks like, a user-friendly interface, like some like ancillary benefits. But the best brands are really built around one main idea, and then everything else becomes supporting proof points. And so don't try to be too many things at once just to stand out.
Yeah, I love it. Awesome. All right, I think we have time for one more quick question before we jump into live Q&A. This one's kind of a fun one, but, can you just quickly discuss like any like successful or innovative approaches that you've seen for creating visual identity elements to support your MVB, and, how to kind of balance creativity with that consistency?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it goes back to, having like systems are everything, right? By the way, in like your life, you're reading Atomic Habits now, and it's if you don't have like a system on how to manage your life, and it just gets more busy and complicated as you age and things happen, no different from your business, right? So having a system on how you develop these things, I think is really important. So step one is like, again, always reverting back to that brand strategy. Who are we? Who are we targeting? What do they need? How can we help them? Right. And that, like, making that kind of the anchor for your MVB. Some of the other things is like developing some mood boards. I think if we're thinking about from like the visual aspect, what do you want the vibe of the brand to be? Like, first of all, who are you targeting? Are you targeting like my dad, like baby boomers, or are you talking to Gen Z? I mean, it's a wildly different, like the way that they like to receive information and be communicated to is wildly different. And so I think once you have a clear idea of, who that person is, start to create like a mood board of the types of visuals and images. Like for, you've seen in my presentation, it's really fun and funky. We use memes to communicate. It's aligns with our target audience of like young founders and entrepreneurs. We use a lot of pop culture references, memes, that really is in alignment with our values and our target customer. So I think, having a mood board and a style guide on specific elements that you kind of, you want to infuse in your image strategy. Perhaps like you're using stock images, but like it's kind of generic just to put a stock image. Maybe you wipe out the background and then you just do a cutout of the person and they're in some kind of like cool, filtered frame. Just different ideas like that if you see them on your LinkedIn profile, you see them on your website, they end up like in an email communication, like consumers start to connect the dots and it becomes a really iconic, memorable image for your brand.
No, I love that. And I think that gives so many great ideas to the entrepreneurs in the audience. Okay, I think we have to jump into live Q&A right now. If you have any questions for us in the audience, please drop them into the Q&A function. We'll try our best to get to as many as possible. So just to kick it off, we have a whole bunch of people asking, like how this framework applies to specific industries. So like, I'm wondering, like, does the minimum viable brand framework, is it more effective for certain industries, whether it's product or service based or tech or non-tech? Like, is it kind of like industry agnostic, or is it more effective for certain businesses?
Yeah. No, I would say, branding as a whole, like the principles of what it takes to build a brand that resonates does not change. It doesn't matter if you are, unless you're targeting like dogs or something, which they wouldn't be the decision maker, right? It would be, the pet owners, but, the overall framework doesn't change. There will be nuances in how you communicate, right? So if you are, let's say, targeting accountants, and they're a more risk adverse population, there's different personality traits that come around like them like making purchasing and buying decisions. So there's specific like language, maybe you want to use more technical terminology. So it's all around, there's nuances in industries, but it's what changes really is the approach in terms of how do these folks want to be communicated to. It's really just learning about like who your demographic is, right? And then you kind of tweak from there, but the actual like steps and frameworks like are consistent across the board, no matter what industry you are, no matter what product or service. Another good example of like kind of industry, not necessarily industry, but stage of business. So if you're targeting startups versus enterprise, if you're B2B versus B2C, right? Or D2C, that you target into some businesses that then sell on to consumers. So you've got like a bifurcated audience. So now it becomes like really fun, right? Because you've got multiple audiences that, they're all different. They all need different things. So you need a really strategic cohesive like architecture of like who these folks are, and then how they want to be communicated to, like what's their style, what's their preference, and then you can kind of go from there.
That's super helpful. I love it. And so we have another question here, and Tushy, I think, was a great example in kind of like how the product itself kind of creates positive impact, in offsetting that water usage. And so this entrepreneur is asking, like about what if there is kind of like an impact or a purpose-driven initiative that is kind of separate from the product or service that you are focusing on, like how might you go about that? And I know you emphasized the story, so I'm wondering if like that ties into it, like if it kind of goes back to the story. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's actually a good question. And it actually reminds me, for Gwen, the female founders community that I co-founded, there was an incredible entrepreneur. Her name was Michelle Bulow, and she created a company called Bella Tuno, and they do those really cool like baby like bibs that like capture the food if it falls.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's like, and they have like hangry and all these like cool cool statements on their products. And so her market is new moms that have babies, and that's basically her business. She sells into retail, I think Nordstrom, Target, tons of huge retailers carrying her line. I think they do some e-commerce. What inspired her why to start her business was wildly different, and she had a sort of like a tragic situation happen in her family, right? And so there was a foundation that she created as a part of that, because it was really connected to like her bigger impact that she wanted to make in the world of like people that were suffering from addiction, actually. And she, so two very different, items. But what she did that I found that was clever, and this is a really good example, is that she found a way, how can we, she's a B Corp, which I love. It's really, for me, the business model of the future. Really companies that are super progressive have made the biggest, like push to be transparent, open up their books, be sustainable, like in terms of the way that they manufacture, provide tons of resources for their employees, pay them like, good wages, all that stuff. But what she does is that they do the buy one, feed one, kind of like the Toms, or where it's like every product sold, they donate a meal to a child in need. And the funds that come from that are then reinvested in this other initiative that's not like super connected.
Wow. Yeah.
There's really creative ways to do that, that you just gotta get creative and gotta think like how this cause is really important to me. It doesn't really fit what we're doing in terms of our startup, but how can we create something that we can give back to that, and that becomes sort of the cause that we end up supporting over time.
Love it. Awesome. All right. We are just out of time, but if you had one key takeaway, a piece of wisdom or something from this conversation or your presentation to leave with the audience, what would that be?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. I think for my mantra, and it is the agency's mantra, right? It's really simple, but it's something that we really like live and stand by, and it's really part of our core values. It's really to, be authentic always, stay relevant, because it's easy to just bog down and just kind of think about yourself and what you're doing, but stay attuned to what's happening, and be agile in your process, and act human. Be normal. Be normal, have fun. Don't take yourself too seriously. I think a lot of companies try to, they're afraid to kind of go there. Of course, there's a lot of nuances in the market that you're going for, but I think, yeah, be authentic, stay relevant, and act human. That's kind of where we'll leave it.
Amazing, Jenny. Thank you so much for setting such an incredible overview and sharing your time with us. I personally learned so much. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you for having me. And hopefully if anybody wants to connect with me after, just say it again, at Brands X Humans on Instagram, and you can follow and send me a DM. Also on LinkedIn, just / Jenny Farias if you want to follow my personal page, and of course subscribe to the blog, which is the Insights tab on the website.
Awesome. Great. And we'll share those links again in the chat. And for anyone still in the audience, thank you for joining us today. We would love for you to join us again for upcoming webinars, which you can view using the link in the chat. Thank you all again so much for joining us today, and we look forward to welcoming you back online with us soon.